please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat box. Let us know where you're tuning in from. We are so glad that you're here to join us for this conversation today. Welcome, everyone. I see some more folks are joining the conversation. As you enter, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat box, share your name and where you are tuning in from. We're so excited that you are here. Welcome to this very important and exciting conversation that we'll be having today. All right, let's get started. Welcome to everyone here on behalf of Rethinking Schools for our session on teaching for Black lives during the rebellion. This is an urgent discussion on teaching and organizing for racial and economic justice in our schools. This conversation continues to be crucial as anti-Black racism is still pervasive in every corner of this country and of this world. Teaching for Black lives directly pushes back on the dominant and harmful narratives that dehumanize Black people by providing educators with critical perspectives on the role of schools in perpetuating anti-Blackness, but also offers examples of what it looks like to celebrate, to affirm and humanize Black people in the curriculum, teaching, and policy. We come together today for an opportunity to hear directly from the co-editors of the book, who will illuminate the possibilities and potentials for schools as sites of resistance, justice, joy, and liberation. My name is Sierra Kaler-Jones, and I am the Education and New Fellow with Teaching for Change and Communities for Just Schools Fund. I've also been an art educator for 10 years and co-create spaces with Black girls to learn and explore Black history, as well as use art as activism and resistance. This event today is sponsored by Rethinking Schools and co-sponsored by Teaching for Change. Rethinking Schools is a nonprofit publisher, you can see my magazine here, an advocacy organization dedicated to sustaining and strengthening public education through social justice teaching and education activism. Their magazines, books, and other resources promote equity and racial justice in the classroom. Teaching for Change provides teachers and parents with the tools to create schools where students learn to read, write, and change the world. The entire Rethinking Schools catalog supports teaching for Black lives, especially the book, Teaching for Black Lives, but also rethinking multicultural education, rethinking ethnic studies, teaching a people's history of abolition and the Civil War, and rhythm and resistance, about teaching poetry for social justice. And our quarterly magazine regularly features stories on how teachers teach a racial justice curriculum. For today's event, please feel free to use the chat box, as you are already doing so wonderfully, to be in conversation with one another. If you have a question for the co-editors, please put the question in the Q&A function so that when we get to the Q&A, we can easily identify questions. Know that we won't be able to get to all of your questions today, but we will definitely try our best. As we navigate technology and this virtual world, please also bear with us amidst any technological challenges that may arise. Please also feel free to tweet about your insights throughout the conversation. We would love to continue the conversation on social media as well. And so we are here to discuss teaching for Black lives, which is truly a gift. The weaving together of personal experiences, art, historical context, and tangible lessons, strategies, and tools have really been an incredible resource for my own teaching. And with that, I am so honored to be in conversation with and introduce our panelists for today's discussion, the co-editors of Rethinking Schools, Teaching for Black Lives, Dyan Watson, Jesse Hagopian, and Wayne Au. Dyan Watson is a former high school teacher and teacher educator. Currently, she serves as the Director for Inclusion at the Oregon Episcopal School and is a Rethinking Schools editor. Some of her works include Teaching for Black Lives, Rhythm and Resistance, Teaching Poetry for Social Justice, and Rethinking Elementary Education. Dyan, we're excited to be in conversation with you today. Jesse Hagopian teaches ethnic studies and is the co-advisor to the Black Student Union at Garfield High School in Seattle. He is a Rethinking Schools editor, the co-editor of Teaching for Black Lives, the co-editor of the forthcoming book, Black Lives Matter at School, and editor of More Than a Score, the new Uprising Against High-Stakes Testing. Jesse, really, really grateful to be in partnership with you in this work and to be in conversation today.
No doubt. Thank you, Sierra. This is going to be fun today. Appreciate you.
Absolutely. Thank you. And lastly, we have Wayne Au, who is a professor at the School of Educational Studies at the University of Washington-Bothell. He is a longtime Rethinking Schools editor, editor of Rethinking Multicultural Education, co-editor of Teaching for Black Lives, and author of A Marxist Education, Learning to Change the World. And so to begin our conversation today, Dyan, I would love to invite you to read an excerpt from your letter to your son.
Thanks, Sierra. Dear Caleb, for 3 years of my K-8 schooling, from 7:40 a.m. until 3:05 p.m., I was Black and invisible. I was bused across town to integrated white school in Southeast Portland, Oregon. We arrived at school promptly at 7:30 a.m. and had 10 full minutes before the white children arrived. We spent that time roaming the halls, happy, free, normal. Once the white children arrived, we became Black and invisible. We were separated so that no more than 2 of us were in a class at a time. I never saw Black people in our textbooks unless they were in shackles or standing with Martin Luther King Jr. Most of us rarely interacted with a Black adult outside the aide who rode the bus with us. I liked school and I loved learning, but I never quite felt right or good. I felt very Black and obvious because I knew that my experience was different from that of my peers. But I also felt invisible because this was never acknowledged in any meaningful way. I became visible again at 3:05 p.m. when I got back on the bus with the other brown faces to make our journey home. Caleb, I want your teachers to help you love being in your skin. I want them to make space for you in their curricula so that you see yourself as integral to this country's history, to your classroom's community, to your peers' learning. I want your teachers to select materials where Blacks are portrayed in ordinary and extraordinary ways that actively challenge stereotypes and biases. Most of all, Caleb, I want your teachers to know you so they can help you grow. As mentioned, when I was in middle school, I lived on the other side of town and was bussed in as part of the distorted way that Portland school authorities decided to integrate the schools. We would get up at 6 in order to eat breakfast and walk to the bus stop in time. It took us a half an hour to get to school. Once there, I had to constantly code switch, learn how not to be overly Black and be better than my white counterparts. Caleb, I want your teachers to know your journey to school, metaphorically and physically. I want them to see you and all of your peers as children from good families. I don't want you to have to earn credit because of whom you're related to or what your parents do for a living. And I don't want your teachers to think that you're special because you have a family that cares about you and is involved in your life. I want them to know that all children are part of families, traditional or not, that help shape and form who they are. As a youngster once, my elementary school held a back to school night that featured student work and allowed families to walk the halls and speak with teachers. In each classroom was a student leader chosen by the teacher. At one point, a couple came in, desiring to speak with my teacher, Mrs. S. She was busy, so I thought I'd chat with them while they waited. As I approached them, they recoiled in fear and with panicked looks turned away from me and said, "Mrs. S?" My teacher looked away from the folks she was working with and said, "It's okay, she's not like the rest." I don't remember what happened next. All I remember is that this seemed to be one of the first in a long line of reassurances that I was special and not like other Black boys and girls. For many years afterward, I was told on more than one occasion, "You're not like other Blacks." This was supposed to be a compliment. Caleb, I pray that your teachers will not look at you through hurtful racial preconceptions. I pray that they will do the work necessary to eliminate racist practices in themselves and in those around them. I pray that they stand up for you in ways that leave you feeling strong and capable. I pray that they will nurture your spirit and that you, in turn, will desire to be a better you. Caleb, I hope that you will have teachers who realize they are gatekeepers. I hope they understand the power they hold and work to discover your talents, seek out your dreams and fan them rather than smother them. I hope they will see you as part of a family with gifts and rich histories that have been passed down to you. I hope they will strive to know you, even when they think they already know you. I hope your teachers will approach you with humility and stay curious about who you are. Son, I end this letter by sharing a story that Grandma has told me many times that I hope will one day resonate with you. On the first day of kindergarten, many of the kids were crying and clinging to their parents, but not me. I was ready. I wanted to be like my 3 older siblings and go to school. So I gave my mom a hug, let go of her hand, waved goodbye, and found my teacher. And remember how I told you that my oldest sister taught me how to read before I went to school? The teacher found this out and used this skill, along with my desire to be at school, to teach the other kids the alphabet and help them learn how to read. I believe in part, that is why I became a teacher. She saw something in me and encouraged me to develop my passion, even at this young, sweet age. That, my son, is my hope for you. I hope your teachers will love you for who you are and the promise of what you'll be. Love, Mama.
Oof. I've read that letter a few times, and just hearing you say it, I'm so glad that I was on mute, because every couple of seconds I was like, yes, yes. I was adding in my own commentary, but I'm just thinking about the number of educators that could use that letter as a text in their classroom, as a launching point for young folks to write their own personal narratives and their own letters to themselves and to the future generation. So thank you so much, Dyan, for sharing that. I really appreciate hearing it from you.
Thank you.
And so now I'm going to look to Wayne. And Wayne, I so appreciate the piece that you and Jesse wrote together, which opens the book with a powerful story of the teacher-led organizing in Seattle's public schools in support of Black Lives Matter, one of my favorite stories. And so would you be able to share with us some of the lessons learned?
Thanks, Sierra, and again, thanks to everyone for being on here for this just beautiful panel and a chance to just be in community with folks in this time. Yeah, really, I want to start with just telling a little bit of the story that's in the article, because it's, I think, one of the biggest lessons we can learn from this is how how powerful it is when even just one elementary school tucked into one very large district in a very large city can really spark a movement for racial justice in education across the country. Now, my son used to attend John Muir Elementary here in Seattle, and it's in South Seattle, sort of in the Rainier Valley neighborhood. And it's an incredible space. So this whole journey really, in some ways, like started with this one thing that happened in John Muir that's so critical. I really remember the day we walked to school. The school is like 2 blocks from my house, and we walk our son to school, in the morning. And there was this one just celebratory day. This goes back 4 years now. This is the fall of 2016. It's hard to believe it's been that long. But there was one morning we walked to school, and I remember it like we were so excited because there was this whole event happening, and there was this energy in the air, and we could hear like the sounds of drummers and stuff, bouncing off the walls of the houses as we approached the school, and we started walking up the block to the school, and we could see people out front lined up and cheering each other on and sort of being there in community and resistance, and it was this wonderful thing. And I think folks who saw that wouldn't know that just earlier that morning there had been bomb sniffing dogs in the school, trying to make sure the school was clear of any physical threats and explosives. And really, the part of the story I start there, but really we got to go back before that, because you know, the threats that were made against John Muir Elementary started from the work that they had been doing around sort of racial justice at John Muir Elementary and trying to better serve their students and their community. And so earlier that summer, they had been doing lots of trainings, and for the last couple of years, they've been doing this work around racial justice at Muir. And there's a particular staff member, Deshaun Jackson, shout out to Deshaun, who's a wonderful educator there. And he wanted to do an event where you had like 100 Black men giving high fives and sort of to change the narrative around education and Black children. And so he was planning this, and in solidarity with the racial justice work they were doing at the school, and in solidarity with Mr. Jackson's work, the staff also decided to create these t-shirts, which you see on the screen now, around supporting Black Lives Matter at John Muir Elementary. And so they made these t-shirts, and they were gonna plan to wear them on the day that Deshaun had organized for this other event. But somehow this got leaked to the media, and then it got picked up by Breitbart and Blue Lives Matter. And so what became this, what started as like really an event that was just to affirm Blackness and Black lives in education at John Muir Elementary, blew up because you know, folks at Breitbart and Blue Lives Matter, like it moved online, and then you know, the threats started to come in. People were calling the school, calling the principal, emailing, all this kind of stuff, and eventually someone made a bomb threat on John Muir Elementary in an online forum. And I always like to stop for a minute and point out, like, to folks to remember, you know, here we have a school that is predominantly Black and brown students, predominantly poor Black and brown students, and just think about the callousness and inhumanity for someone to feel like they want to threaten the lives of this community, of these kids, right? Elementary school kids and their teachers and the aides and everybody around an affirmation of Blackness. But what was amazing, and again, this is another lesson to be learned from this, is to watch what happened as soon as the threats were made and everything. Like the official event got canceled, but what happened was, in secret, a bunch of folks decided, hey, we're gonna try and do this event anyways. And so that morning I was describing in the beginning was the morning that folks came and lined up and had this beautiful event and singing and drumming and the school was just alive, and it was amazing. And then what happened after that is like the city united around the John Muir Elementary staff and community to really support this effort. And so like folks in the Seattle Education Association got together, the teachers union showed support, community groups from around the area showed support, and we started building, we started organizing with other teachers and other buildings, so that we ended up, so that there was like a statement and a really push to have a district-wide Black Lives Matter at School Day. That became one of the focuses of our organizing. And it really connected with the Seattle Teachers, Seattle Parent Teachers Association was on board with this too. And our momentum grew so strong that in probably the first time I've ever seen for a really deeply activist sort of organizing event, connected racial justice, like the administration, like we got, like this became so popular that the administration also ended up endorsing it. For Seattle Public Schools administration endorsed it. And so we had like teachers and parents and community and Seattle schools all in support, at least vocally in support of supporting Black Lives Matter in schools. And so we had like a huge organizing effort. You know, big ups to Jesse and the rest of the crew in the Seattle Education Association and the social equality educators for doing that work, putting together curriculum, and we organized this huge day, and there was a big festival event at the end. It was amazing. And it became, you know, if you read the story of the folks in Philly and the folks who started the national movement around Black Lives Matter at School Week, it really became like, it really became a key piece, an impetus for getting this thing going. And then Ursula, if we can move back to that last slide real quick, sorry, didn't want to jump from there quite yet. That last slide is really important because I just wanted you all to see like the staff at John Muir Elementary who kicked this off and were so brave in the face of white supremacist threats. This community that came together to really stand up for our kids and stand up to stand up for our Black students and to push against anti-Blackness and to fight white supremacy. It was amazing staff. There's some amazing folks there. And I think, you know, all respect due to these folks in one little elementary school in Seattle really became a piece in what grew into a national movement. And I think if there's one lesson to take from all this, is folks need to understand their power and that they are powerful, and that we can, when we get together and fight this stuff, we can grow real movements that can really push change across the country.
Thank you so much for sharing that incredible story, Wayne. I am feeling very inspired. Just the words, one elementary school sparks a movement, to affirm Blackness and Black lives, and how despite the threats of emotional, psychological, and physical violence of white supremacy and anti-Blackness, y'all filled the air with resistance through song, through music, through love. And so what a powerful illustration of the strategic praxis of organizing, and how as educators, we play such a pivotal role in organizing for Black lives. So thank you so much for that.
Absolutely.
And so now, Jesse, I'm going to turn to you, and I am so grateful for the conversations that we've been able to have about teaching and organizing and the struggle for freedom and liberation. Right now, we see monumental wins by organizers across the country for police-free schools, as well as increased attention to teaching and mandating Black history and ethnic studies. So can you tell us a little bit more about what are you seeing in the national scene? What are your reflections on this moment, specifically in relation to teaching and organizing?
For sure. First, I just want to thank you for all the work you did organizing for this event, and Dyan and Wayne, it's great to be with you all in community, and all the hundreds of people that have logged on with us. This is hopefully a great beginning to a year of resistance against racism. And the movement has just exploded in ways that I've never seen in my lifetime over the course of this summer. And it's truly inspiring. I mean, the mass uprisings in the streets were described by the Washington Post as the broadest rebellion in US history, with the most numbers of towns and people across the country participating. And we're beginning to see the types of struggles that are in teaching for Black lives as historical lessons, right? We're beginning to see them actually erupt again before our eyes, with the potential for mass transformation and change. And we're seeing real victories against anti-Blackness around the country. I mean, students have risen up in the wake of the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Tony McDade and Ahmaud Arbery and so many others. And it's really young people who have demanded that police be removed from their schools. And that has become one of the central struggles of this uprising. And police have been removed in Minneapolis, in St. Paul, in Oakland, in Seattle, I'm proud to say. Two incredible youth here in Seattle, Angelina and Kittis, started a petition. And within a couple days, they had 14,000 signatures asking for the police to be removed from schools and to reinvest those funds in restorative justice counselors to actually solve problems rather than punish and push out students. And we're seeing policing budgets being redirected towards social services and education as more and more people take the streets. And really, I think that the students today are becoming the educators, right? I think that the young people who have taken the streets across this country are teaching one of the greatest lessons. They've created one of the greatest lesson plans I've ever seen, right? To transform America. They're teaching us what solidarity looks like. They're teaching us what courage looks like. They're teaching their teachers what struggle and victories can look like. And I think that we have a lot of learning to do as educators this year. And we should be very curious when we go back to the classroom this year and asking our students about their experiences, about how they organized and how they won, and encourage them to share those stories in the classroom with us so that we can learn from them. And I think that this moment also demands that teachers provide some context to the struggle to help students make sense of the anti-Blackness that they're seeing in video feeds and social media, and also for them to understand the historical lessons that can help them build larger struggles for justice today. And that requires that we help scaffold some difficult conversations, right? And I think for too long, too many educators have been scared to bring in these difficult discussions about police violence, about institutional racism. And, you know, sometimes people will say you're politicizing the classroom if you allow students to talk about these issues. But I would suggest that it's a political act to bar these discussions. And I would say that students are having these discussions whether we allow them in class or not, right? They have been traumatized by the videos of these murders, and they're discussing them on the school bus, on the playground, in the hallways. And the question for us as educators are we going to allow these discussions to come into our classroom, and are we going to be able to scaffold them to help them make sense of what they're seeing, right? And I just want to end by saying that to help with this process, the organization Black Lives Matter at School has launched a whole new initiative this year that I just want to touch on briefly. Wayne did a great job talking about how it went from John Muir Elementary School to a citywide action in 2016, where some 3,000 educators came to school wearing those shirts that said Black Lives Matter, we stand together. And then the educators in Philly saw what we had done, and they transformed the action and really took it to a whole nother level, right? They went from a day of action to a week of action, and they broke down the 13 principles of the Black Lives Matter Global Network into teaching points for each day of the week. And then the following year, we all got together and launched a national Black Lives Matter at School week of action. And for the last several years, we've had the first week of February as the week of action. And we want to continue with that this year, but in this moment, there is urgency to expand it from a week of action. And the week of action was never meant, of course, to confine Black studies to 1 week in the year. It was meant to highlight important demands to undo institutional racism and to press educators to teach for Black lives all throughout the year. Well, now we're providing the scaffolding for educators to launch the Year of Purpose. And I just want to say a word about the Year of Purpose. This is an initiative that asks teachers to reflect on 5 questions about their practice in relationship to anti-racist pedagogy. And we want them to reflect on that before the first day of school, and then check in throughout the year with other educators about their progress towards their goals in anti-racist teaching. And in addition to that, we have a day of action every month that we're asking educators to participate in to challenge anti-Blackness and to affirm our Black students. And the first day of action, we're calling on educators, whatever your first day of school is, to participate in our Black to School initiative, where you reflect on the questions for the year. You can create a graffiti wall where educators and students can talk about what they want to do differently this year to further the struggle for Black lives. And then, you know, we have in October 14th is George Floyd's birthday. We have a day of action then. We have days of action for Black trans people. We have days of action for Black women, Black students, Black educators all throughout the year. And so if you go to blacklivesmatteratschool.com, you can get the full story on how to participate in our Year of Purpose. And you can find the link to our change.org petition that you can sign up to pledge to participate in. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Jesse. I'm so moved by the young people as well. And young people continue to demand the education they deserve. They always have. They guide the way, and we must not only follow, but we have to support them and to actually listen to those demands. As you said, they've created the curriculum. I love how you said, be curious as you go back to the classroom this year, and having humility as educators rather than stifling those conversations, because what a privilege it is to learn alongside students as we are in this fight for liberation together. I'm reminded of a scholar I really admire, Dr. Brittany Cooper, says we have to be co-conspirators. So let's be co-conspirators towards freedom alongside the young people. So now I'm really excited to dig into the Q&A with the panelists. And so the first question that we'll look into together is, the book begins with the quote, "Black students' minds and bodies are under attack." This continues to ring true. Even in emergency remote learning, where students are learning from their homes, we are still seeing the same type of policing and psychological and emotional violence. So for example, 15-year-old Grace, a Black girl from Michigan, was sent to juvenile detention for not doing her homework. Although she's home now, she should have never been sent to juvenile detention in the first place. I've also seen classroom Zoom rules circulating social media with rules like maintain eye contact at all times with the camera, no eating or drinking, while some schools are returning in person that are not mandating masks, but have been policing Black students with dress codes for years. So to the panelists, what suggestions do you all have for educators as we enter a new unprecedented school year, or even in students' homes, there is covert policing and control?
Yeah, this is a great question. Maybe I could start by talking about what the attack on Black bodies looks like, and then turn it over to other folks. But I think that we have to understand this rebellion across the country that's happening is not just in reaction to those horrific murders that people have seen on social media, but it's also their own direct experience with racial violence and institutional racism that is connected with what they saw on that video. And unfortunately, when we say Black bodies are under attack, it's exactly what we mean in school building after school building across this country. I want to highlight some painful examples for people, and it's hard to even share these, but I think it's incumbent upon educators to fully understand that what the national picture looks like in terms of violence against our Black students. And so I want to talk about just a couple cases. We could be here for the rest of the forum talking about the violence against Black bodies in school, just from last year. So I'm going to highlight a couple from last year. There was an 11-year-old girl who was attending a school in New Mexico last year, and she left the cafeteria to go outside and play after lunch. And a police officer in her school building believed that she had taken an extra carton of milk from the cafeteria. And for that transgression, he charged her, grabbed her, threw her up against the wall, tackled her to the ground. And that's not just her account of what happened, that's captured on video, a horrific video for everyone to see. And then it turns out she hadn't even taken the extra carton of milk, as if that, I mean, it's hard to even describe these events, but we have to look at them squarely. You may have heard of what happened in Florida last year, where there was a 6-year-old girl who was having a temper tantrum in class, and the police officer handcuffs her, arrests her, drags her to his squad car as she's screaming, "Please give me a second chance." He drives her to the detention center where he fingerprints her, takes her mugshot, and her grandma came to pick her up and told the media that her granddaughter was suffering from sleep apnea, and that's why she was having a difficult time in school. But temper tantrums are developmentally appropriate for a 6-year-old, and it should be the role of the school to figure out how to nurture that student, how to support them, how to meet their needs, not punish and abuse them, right? Or you may have heard about the football players at Detroit's Denby High School who were playing in the Division 5 semifinals against an unbeaten Almont High. And several of the players took a knee during the game last year. And for that, the white fans on the other side started throwing garbage down on their heads, screaming at them, and even yelling the N-word at these students. I mean, this is just a small snapshot. Here in Seattle, there was a whole rash of stories. There was a teacher who threw kids into lockers, and that was removed from their file by the school district. And the abuse was allowed to continue, and we could go on and on. But I think that the last point you make is so important right now, Sierra, that now that we're out of school buildings for the year, people are finding new ways to police our students in their own homes, and we have to stand against that. We want to get cops out of schools, but we also have to stop school districts from trying to replace them by turning teachers into cops and policing students in their own homes with their behavior, these dress codes. You know, we need to figure out ways to nurture and support our youth during these difficult times in the pandemic, and not overly prescribe their behavior. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, a lot of my work is focused on high-stakes standardized testing, in terms of my scholarly work and activism too. And the whole watching the pandemic function, like seeing how things have played out in education because of the pandemic, I think has really like highlighted the policing nature of school in some ways, right? Like, because everything's been brought home, so to speak, there's a few things that get brought up in this. So for instance, we've known forever that, educational achievement, all sorts of things, whether it's high stakes standardized testing or even grades, the students' performances on these things tend to be pretty much an expression of like access to resources in communities, and a lack of, and oftentimes a product of the lack of investment in communities that we've had in this country. And so what I feel like we see happening now is like, we're really seeing with COVID and the pandemic, we're really seeing how like it's peeled back this whole layer, just kind of showing that, oh yes, performance in school is like, oh hey, it is really deeply connected to like what resources there are at home, right? And we're getting this sort of head-on collision right now of that. So for me, I feel like in the midst of all this, what I really want folks to take away is to understand like testing, assessment, and grading in this context is worthless, and we should be throwing it out the window. Like, we need to be focusing on like students and families' mental health in the ongoing crisis, and we need to be thinking about learning, but really ask the question like, what is learning and what does that mean and what's important, and then like, how do we measure that? Because all these traditional metrics that we have around test scores and grades and everything, it's all it's to me, it's all worthless in the face of the ongoing sort of trauma and crisis that's happening right now, amongst folks. And then really, it also like, as we've seen, Sarah, as you raised, like these things also become, because they're so closely connected to like access to resources at home in the communities, then like testing and scoring and homework and grading and homework all become sort of like entry points for policing like parents and communities and homes and what students are doing, right? Because they become these lenses, these judgments essentially on what you have access to, right? And then you get punished for it too, right? You get this whole piece around, we basically treat education in the form of basically of retributive justice. It's all about retribution, right? You either do this stuff or you are going to get punished, right? And so one thing I want to say to folks is that if we're really about abolition and abolitionist teaching and education, then we need to be rethinking the whole structure we have around grades, around homework, tests. Like these things are all punitive and disciplinary in nature, the way they're structured now. And if we're gonna be really looking at how to make education more meaningful, like in general, but particularly in the pandemic times, then we need to be abandoning these traditional measurements and be really thinking through, like, how do we engage students in a way that's humanizing and not destructive and traumatic to them. And so that's one thing I would push at around all this stuff.
Yes, absolutely. And going off of that, I'm seeing this question come up in the Q&A as well. In light of the COVID-19 global pandemic and continued racial injustice and violence, how can we create humanizing classroom spaces for students while not re-traumatizing them? Given the context of the rebellion, how do we teach for Black lives in a way that doesn't demoralize students, but rather encourages empowerment and resistance?
I think one of the ways is to remember that we weren't inherently slaves, right? And so one of the problems in US history is that the first time that a lot of young people are taught about Black people in our country's history, it starts with slavery. And where do you go from that? If you always see me as something to be helped, then I can't be human. And so you humanize me by seeing me as your equal, as a member of a community that has good things and bad things, and you celebrate the goodness about my past. And you also don't portray me as a victim, right? So too much of our history portrays Black people as victims, and we don't talk about all of the resistance that Black folks have been a part of. And we also don't talk about allyship enough either. It's often pitted, you know, one race against another or several races against one race. And I think that's a good place to start, is to see allyship and resistance.
Yeah, thank you for saying that, Dyan. I mean, over and over, so many of us Black folks have had the experience of, okay, it's time to talk about Black history now. Let's talk about the enslavement of Africans, and then they leave our history there. And, you know, we need to be talking about the many revolts against slavery, the many contributions and struggles all throughout history. And these are some of the greatest stories in human history of resistance, of liberation, of perseverance that can really capture all of our students' imagination. And I think that this work becomes a little more challenging now that many of us are moved to online schooling, right? Humanizing our lessons, building relationships with our students that are really, I think, the foundation of good pedagogy is having the students know that you care for them before they can really learn anything. And to that end, I know, Sierra, you've actually done some great work building community, finding ways to make connections with your students online. And I think if you just shared some of your strategies with everyone, they would benefit a lot from that.
Thanks, Jesse. I appreciate that a lot. I know with my students, one of the things that we do, we talk about Afrofuturism. We analyze Janelle Monáe's music videos. We look at Erykah Badu's work. We use song lyrics like India Ari's I Am Not My Hair, really centering Blackness and affirming the brilliance of Blackness. But in terms of creating online spaces that are as comfortable as they can be in this virtual moment, one of the ways that I try to build virtual community is by starting each class with an Ubuntu, which is Zulu for I am because we are. And we use this word instead of icebreaker to emphasize the importance of the collective. So for example, one of the Ubuntu questions I asked the first class is, share something meaningful to you that makes you feel powerful and bring it into the camera. And I asked them to hold this item close to them because that then becomes their talking piece for our talking circles. And we use talking circles as our closing, rooting the practice in the rich history, and traditions of Indigenous circle keeping. We learn the history, how they're a sacred way of life, how we're deeply indebted to those who have carried these traditions into modern times. And so what we would do is we use our talking piece. So here's mine. And I would say, I would like to pass my talking piece to Jesse. And Jesse would take his talking piece and he would continue on with his part of the conversation. So shout out to Girls for Gender Equity for modeling this in one of our meetings to really create the space for me to garner some ideas that I could bring into teaching. And thanks, Jesse, for that invitation.
Thank you for sharing that, because, you know, I do peace circles every week with my class, and I recommend that everybody find ways to take time away from your academic discipline and build community, because having tough discussions about race requires a lot of trust and community building, right? And so these are opportunities for us to solve problems if they arise in the classroom, but more importantly, to build community so that we don't have problems as much in the first place. And we do the talking piece, and I was just so frustrated that we couldn't do that this year, but you gave me such a great idea for how to continue that practice virtually. So I appreciate that.
Thank you so much. And so I want to make sure that we have an opportunity to really discuss one of my favorite parts of the book, and the importance of examining race and racism through an intersectional lens. So Black people do not have a singular experience. There's so much richness, beauty, and brilliance like we were talking about, and highlighting and humanizing, creating humanizing classroom spaces. And so can you share with us how you center the multiple identities that Black students might hold by teaching about the contributions of Black women, Black LGBTQ+ folks, Black Muslim folks, Afro-Latinx folks, and so many more in your curriculum?
Yes. Let me thank you for this question, because I think it's really important for all the educators out there to understand that teaching for Black lives means understanding that all Black people experience institutional racism, structural racism in this country, but also there isn't one singular Black experience, right? And you're going to have to get to know who the Black children are in your classroom specifically, and what their specific needs are if you're going to be effectively teaching for Black lives. And that's why we insist that teachers develop an intersectional approach to teaching for Black lives. So we have reflected that in this book, Teaching for Black Lives, with several chapters that I want to highlight right now for folks to dive into. We have a chapter on space for young Black women. We have a chapter on rethinking Islamophobia, combating bigotry, and raising the voices of Black Muslims, that really helps educators teach that history of Black Muslims, as well as a chapter called Rethinking Identity, Afro-Mexican history, right? Looking at that intersection of Latinx and Black identity. And one of my favorite essays in the book is called Queering Black History and Getting Free. And I just want to read a quick excerpt from that chapter to have people understand what we mean by the necessity to queer Black history. It says, queering Black history means lifting up the stories of Black LGBTQ people. It means resolving that not one more student learns about the I Have a Dream speech without learning about Bayard Rustin, the man who led the planning of the March on Washington, at least not on our watch. It means really learning about him, knowing his contributions to the civil rights movement, reading Time on Two Crosses right next to the autobiography of Martin Luther King Jr., having discussions in our classroom and on social media about the letter from a Birmingham jail, while also discussing why Bayard Rustin too was arrested, how he was relegated to the background by his peers, and why we must, and what we must do to prevent that from ever happening again in the Black freedom movement. Queering Black history means canonizing Marsha P. Johnson as a matriarch of Black America, right? And this is Marsha P. Johnson that we have this beautiful image of in the book, and understanding her as a Black trans woman that needs to be seen as a pivotal part of the Black freedom struggle, and also one of the people who launched the LGBTQ liberation movement and the Stonewall Rebellion, right? And so really, I think it's that intersectional approach to Blackness that can meet the needs of our students in this context. So thank you for the question.
And I'll just add that, so not only do you want to do that for the Black students that are in your class and in your school, but we want to be careful to make sure that folks who don't have Black students in their class, that they're doing it as well. So what literature are you having your students read? What, even at the K-5 level, what books are you reading out loud to children? And do you have in the library, in your own personal classroom library, that either pigeonhole Blacks as one kind, or that actually do what we do for white people, which is say there are all kinds of Black people, right? Because there are all kinds of white people, there are all kinds of Asian people, there are all kinds of people. And so don't forget, those of you who are listening and your colleagues, to remind folks, it doesn't matter if you don't have any Black people in your school or in your classroom, you still should be teaching about Black folks and integrating them into the curriculum, and certainly talking about intersectionality with all people, but especially with Black people.
And there's one more short excerpt I thought might be relevant to this, and I know we got to move to questions, but there's a piece that really strikes me, and there's in our book, there's a poem called Two Sets of Notes that I think really gets at what our project is as educators teaching for Black lives. And in this poem, I'll just read a short excerpt. It says, "I always take two sets of notes, one set to ace the test and one set I call the truth. And when I find historical contradictions, I use the first set as proof that Black youth's minds are being polluted, convoluted, diluted, not culturally rooted. Can it be any clearer? Black children, look in the mirror. You are the reflection of divinity. Don't let them fool you with selective memory. Walk high. Listen to the elders who spoke. Black students, brown students, all students always take two sets of notes." And I just feel like our job as educators is to not demand that our Black students take two sets of notes, that we can just teach to the truth and not have to dilute it anymore. And that's, I think, what this historical moment is calling on us to do.
Jesse, could you tell us what page you just read from? There are a couple people asking.
Yes, and that poem's by M.K. Asante, and it's on page 68 of Teaching for Black Lives.
Thanks for sharing that powerful passage. Wow. So I see a number of questions coming in through the Q&A, and one of the questions that is coming up quite frequently is, we would love your advice on how else the book can be used by parents, by administrators, and by teacher educators in teacher preparation programs.
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I think we need to talk about all the history that's often left out of the standard master narrative textbooks. And Wayne, I know you had maybe a little to add on that.
Yeah, well, for me, there's a few different ways. I mean, one is you know, I think teacher educators could be using this book in a few different ways, and one is to basically highlight you know, histories that have been marginalized or silenced, right? And so we have a few things in the book, you know, stuff on, you know, the Black Panther Party and the COINTELPRO, you know, attacks on the Black liberation struggles in the United States. There's just a wide variety, you know, a wide range of things. And so I think for one, pre-service and then in-service teacher education could be using this book to just give people more content knowledge, right? That's one of the big things I found in my work, particularly doing like ethnic studies work with teachers, is they just don't have the base content knowledge on these histories to even begin to think about teaching it, right? They have at least a two-step process in front of them. The other way I think, like for me, and this is kind of true with all Rethinking Schools books, right? When I have, for me and my teacher ed work, I'll bring this book and we'll use this book also to highlight like, how do you do the work, right? Because not only the pieces in here about like spaces for folks to get educated on these issues, but they also, a lot of them serve as models, right? And so even going back to the COINTELPRO and teaching the Black Panther stuff, right? I mean, that's an incredible mixer and sort of role play where folks can see how do we do this stuff in engaging ways that can bring students and their lives and communities into the classroom. And so these books serve as spaces, to both not only to eat, but also to learn how to put the plate together, right? It might be the way to think about it, or how to cook the recipe, right? And then the other thing is we're seeing a lot of folks, and Jesse, I know you can talk about this later, but we're seeing a lot of folks buying like sets of the book for schools or sites or districts, and then using it as a space for study groups and give space for folks to get together and read and talk about it. And teachers. And the thing is to do this work, and a lot of people are posting questions in the chat, in the Q&A around how do I do this in predominantly white spaces, right? And really, to me, the question is, since our teachers are predominantly white across the country, is how do we move this group of teachers along and their understanding of a lot of the stuff, their critical understandings. And I think teachers need space to like get together away from students and away from administration to read some stuff and be the intellectuals that they are or can be, and learn and think and talk, and then that's like one of the best ways to help them start moving this work into the practice in the classrooms.
Yeah, and I would encourage schools to do what Lewis and Clark in Portland, Oregon did. Every teacher there is required to buy this book. This is a textbook for the program. So every single teacher or teacher candidate has it. And then every single class that they take uses it, right? Because you can ask someone to buy a book, but if you don't actually require them to read it and do assignments based on it, then that's pointless. And so it really sends a clear message from day one. This is important stuff, right? It's so important that you're going to use this book the entire year that you're here, the entire time that you're here, and in every class. And then I know that at the school where I work now, Oregon Episcopal School, there are some teacher groups who have formed some book groups. And again, Jesse's going to talk a little bit more about that later. But I would just encourage folks to group up and start going through the book together and thinking about asking questions. I talked to a parent just the other day, and he on his own just formed a book group with some other parents. And I'm suggesting that it's hard for me to suggest because it's a book that I am a part of, but I think if administrators said, hey, this is a great book to do as a parent, then that would be really a good idea.
Yeah, I don't know if we have other questions or if I should come in on this one too.
Yeah, I actually have another question that I would love to answer here. There's a Jesse coming in too from the Q&A who is asking about, do you all have advice for engaging families in the greater community in conversations about anti-Blackness across different languages and cultural norms, recognizing that anti-Blackness, white supremacy is global? And so what does that look like to create those conversations and spaces for those conversations in our school buildings, but also in our communities with families?
Yeah, that's a powerful question. I think finding ways to celebrate Blackness in our schools that get all kinds of families from different backgrounds excited about the contributions that Black people have given to this country is so important. And, one way we do that here in Seattle is every year we have a celebration at the end of Black Lives Matter at School Week. And we have a young, gifted, and Black talent showcase that becomes something that is a buzz in schools across the city, and students want to get ready to participate in it and create great spoken word pieces, dances, poetry, music that they can share together. And I think that can create a lot of excitement around the great contributions that Black people have. And then, you know, the next step is to organize the study groups, right? And to actually get your community to sit down and look at its relationship to anti-Blackness, and to read about that, and come up with an action plan for undoing that. You know, Wayne's shirt, Asians for Black Lives,
Yeah, I
right?
you can see it.
There it is. You know, that's such important work that all communities find out how to be co-conspirators in undoing anti-Blackness.
Yeah, I think yeah, I was gonna do the shirt too, just because I think it's critical for folks like, you know, for non-Black communities of color, who, you know, have experienced real like racism and racial discrimination, institutionalized racism, like these things are real. But for those folks to understand that, you know, the roots of what they've experienced as minoritized populations, right, is the same white supremacy that, you know, that is at the root of anti-Blackness, you know, in this country. And so trying to get folks in other communities to really like understand those histories, understand their own histories within the framework of white supremacy, right, to me, it helps make a natural bridge to say, hey, the same thing that's happened, like, you know, it's manifested in different ways, but the same system that has treated you in these particular ways is also at the root of anti-Blackness, you know, in this country now. And so trying to figure out ways to sort of bridge that divide, so to speak, so that folks can just see, like, you know, the racism over here is being used to pitch you against these folks over here, right? And we can use that, you know, as a way to sort of cut through a lot of that anti-Blackness, and trying to get folks to understand that they're actually in solidarity with communities, and not in opposition with each other.
Thank you so much for that. And as our last question, this is a question that I'm seeing coming up quite often in the Q&A and also through the chat box, is many folks are looking for advice for how to talk to folks that are really adverse to the idea of teaching for Black lives. So how do you get administrators, how do you get colleagues, how do you get communities on board to teach for Black lives and to really center the beauty and the brilliance of Blackness in schools when there are folks that believe in white supremacist ideologies and values?
Yeah, that is the great challenge of struggle, right? I think that so much of the mythology of US history, the way that it's taught with the standard corporate curriculum that glorifies master narratives that are Eurocentric, also has this message that change is created by great individuals, right? And it's such a hyper focus on individuality. And even when they examine incredible movements like the civil rights movement, they make it seem as if it was only because of Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks and these very exceptional people that a movement like that can occur. And they neglect to teach about the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the masses of young people that were really the engine of this movement, right? And so if, you know, our book, Teaching for Black Lives, tries to correct that narrative by having role plays about the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Black Panther Party, and other collectives that challenge institutional racism. And we do that not just because we want people to understand these historical lessons, but we want to have them apply them today. And so when you're thinking about how to make change in your own school, how to challenge educators to teach for Black lives, you also need to think about a collective approach, right? And so to take a collective approach means find a couple allies that you have in your building. Do a study group around teaching for Black lives, or Dr. Bettina Love's book, We Want to Do More Than Survive, right? Abolitionist teaching. Find a book that can unite people in your school and build a collective, so that when you go into your staff meeting, you are collectively raising your voices for wanting to challenge anti-Blackness and move towards a model of teaching for Black lives. And I guess I'll just want to end by saying that I think teaching for Black lives isn't just about the content. It's not just about teaching the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee that's often left out of the textbooks. It's also about a pedagogical approach that isn't about rote memorization. It's not about teacher lectures, but about collaboration and projects and role plays, right? And I think that we also need to just reframe the way we see our Black students when they come into the classroom. And our goal is not to, quote, close the achievement gap, but rather to end the education debt that's owed to Black children, right? And when we reframe that, we see that there is this deficit model that's often applied to our Black children that says they're far behind their white peers, and instead of looking at the strengths that they bring to our classrooms. And that's what I want to urge educators to do this year as they enter the classroom, to see the many talents and the brilliance of our Black children. And it was really driven home for me when I started teaching ethnic studies, which was a multiracial class. And I had students who were predominantly white in the AP courses in my ethnic studies class, as well as the, quote, general ed students who were mostly Black and brown students. And in that mixed setting, when I told the students that they were not going to have any multiple choice tests this year, you know, some of my white students got anxiety from that because they were used to those tests and scoring very well on them. And instead, when our assessments were about collectively solving problems and having conversations and projects about how to identify a problem in our society and fix that problem, what we saw was that our Black students excelled in that skill because they were very aware of many deep societal problems and institutional racism, and were able to explain these things at a much higher level than some of their white peers. And by reframing what was important in my class, we were able to highlight and support the gifts of our Black students and have them learn from each other. And that's where I think we can move to this idea of Black joy in our classroom that I think Dr. Bettina Love writes so brilliantly about in her book, and really fostering Black joy in our classrooms this year.
Thank you so much. I'm looking at the clock and I'm like, where did this time go? Because I feel like we could all be in conversation together for hours about not only the importance of teaching for Black lives, but the urgency and how it continues to be urgent. It's always been urgent. And so just as a few key takeaways from the conversation, and I know that the Rethinking Schools team is going to be following up with everyone with an email, but just to quickly share some of my key takeaways from this conversation. One, we have to organize to resist and dismantle all forms of white supremacy and anti-Blackness in our schools and classrooms, from the curriculum to high-stakes testing to SEL when it's used as a form of control and policing, to policies. Two, we should approach the new school year beginning with community building opportunities, with curiosity, with humility, because teaching isn't just about the content, it's a pedagogical approach, as you said, Jesse. It's an orientation to the world rooted in justice because our students demand better from the education system. It's our job to teach the truth, not sanitizing the dominant narrative and moving to teaching beyond heroes and holidays, to borrow from my colleagues at Teaching for Change, because truth telling is a form of love. And lastly, as educators, we have a duty and a responsibility to stand with and beside our students, to learn together, to organize, to resist, and to dream the world that we all deserve into being. And so as we are getting ready to wrap, I'm going to pass it quickly over to Jesse to share a few exciting announcements for additional resources and opportunities.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I just also want to urge people to stay on the Zoom for a minute, because we're going to have a link where they can do an evaluation of what you've learned here today. So I hope that everyone will fill out that evaluation before you leave the forum, and that should be dropped in the chat very soon. But we have an exciting announcement to everybody, so thanks for staying till the end. And we are excited to say that we got a generous grant that's going to allow us to start study groups around teaching for Black lives. And we're going to begin with 25 Teaching for Black Lives study groups this school year. And this is a free professional learning opportunity. Each group will receive free copies of the book, a subscription to Rethinking Schools, and then you will organize and do several sessions on the book yourselves. And then one of the editors will meet with your study group, or some of the contributors to the book as well can meet with your study group and help you deepen your practice of teaching for Black lives. So I hope that you will apply for this opportunity. We're can only take 25 at this time, but if there's great need, we hope to be able to expand it beyond. So we're looking forward to working with communities across this country in this work. I also just want to end by saying I'm really excited that Sierra and I are going to we're going to collaborate on a new project. We're going to launch a podcast together around teaching the Black freedom struggle. So look out for that coming this fall.
Thank you so much, Jesse. I'm really looking forward to that. Please, 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 everyone, apply to these teacher study groups. What an incredible opportunity to deepen our connections to this work and to each other. And so in closing, please also fill out the evaluation form that's coming for your chat through the chat box. We would love to hear your feedback and your thoughts for continued conversations together. We're going to be sending out a follow-up email with the code and with the evaluation. So make sure that you keep a lookout in your inbox. And before we leave, can we give a huge round of applause, a huge thank you to Wayne, Jesse, and Dyan for this incredible conversation and the learnings today. Thank you. What an honor to be in conversation with you all, and what a gift to spend this Friday together. May we also, yes.
Thank you so much, y'all. So great to be with you today.
Yes.
Thank you to the interpreters.
Yes.
So much.
Maybe also give a big, huge round of applause to the interpreters for being with us today. We are so grateful for the incredible work that you do. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And last but certainly not least, thank you to the Rethinking Schools team who is working tirelessly behind the scenes to make all of this come together. And thank you to Teaching for Change, the co-sponsor for this conversation today. Please support their work.
Shout out to Missy and to Ursula and the whole team. You guys are great.
Yes, thank you all so much for being with us today. What an important and powerful conversation. I look forward to opportunities to continue to be in conversation, continuing to do the work. It's up to all of us to teach for Black lives, to create deep relationships inside and outside of schools, to center humanizing praxis, to ensure that schools are truly spaces where Black students, all Black students, are celebrated and affirmed in their brilliance. Thank you all so much for being with us here today.